one, go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual Gen Con event of talking about the design philosophies behind Marvel Crisis Protocol. I'm joined with my space-age companion, Pagani. How you doing, Pagani?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm doing great, but I've got a little bit of feedback. Josh, I'm both hearing the Twitch and Pagani.
Oh, whoops. Sorry.
Yeah. I'm living in a time loop, folks. This is great. This is what happens. Josh, you're killing me.
It's fixed now.
Is it?
Yes.
Pagani? How you doing?
I'm doing great.
Okay.
Better than you.
I think we might be back to normal because I'm not hearing myself like 5 times. So I hope you guys are doing well. I hope you've had a fun first day of online Gen Con. And we're going to dive in today and we're going to be talking about our design philosophies, both as designers, developers, and also, of course, very focused on Marvel Crisis Protocol and what we're looking to do as we dive in, create content for this amazing game. So, Pagani, why don't you kick us off?
Well, I'm Pagani. I'm the lead developer for the game. And when it comes to design philosophy, I personally focus a lot on player experience and player choices whenever I'm writing or developing rules. So one of the things that was really important to me when we were making Crisis Protocol was to have a lot of different ways for players to make choices about things. And that could be from movement, that could be from which abilities to use, that could be from list construction for your roster. All that kind of thing is always super duper important whenever I'm looking at rules, right? I don't want to make something where you get stuck going down a single path. So that's sort of my core design philosophy is let the players make choices and let the players decide what they're going to do and don't force them to do things, I guess.
Yeah, so for me, I mean, obviously, I very much agree and am in alignment with the idea behind player choice, like player interaction. The more options that you can have, the more engaging I think the experience is. And then, of course, the more rewarding it is as you see those choices pay off or, of course, fail spectacularly. And that leads to another part, which I really like in games, is that I'm a very big proponent of randomness, of an element of chance. I go so far as to love games that are completely 100% random in certain aspects, depending on the game experience. But even in games that are strategic, where there's a high tactical element, there's a high level of thought and complexity going into what you're trying to do in your turn and the moving parts, I still want that random element. Because to me, the excitement for a lot of games comes from seeing if your luck pays out. So that's another really big part for me. I know, Pagani, you're a big proponent of I'm going to stack the numbers as much as I can to minimize my risk or the random elements of luck.
Yeah, and I think that comes from my tournament background, right? I'm usually a competitive player when I play games, so I like to find ways to mitigate risks. But I think at the same time, those risks are also what makes things really fun, right? And it was definitely one of the main goals of Crisis Protocol as we were making it was to make sure the game is fun. I mean, that should be a given, but to sort of have that randomizing factor be a core tenet of the game, because in superhero everything, right? You always have that chance for this crazy plan to work out. So we really wanted to make sure that when we did this kind of stuff, we didn't have sort of purely formulaic gameplay where you can plan out your entire round, your entire turn, and know exactly what's going to happen. Because that randomness, that state of unknowing, really gives a good feeling to the game and really gives a good, a good foundation for us to build the characters off of, right? Because even Black Widow can punch Thanos in the jaw and get some damage through, right?
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I think those moments of extreme dice swings either way lead back to the narrative that you're crafting. And this is one of the really, to me, the core elements of Marvel Crisis Protocol, and especially one of the big things that I was looking at as I wrote the initial designs for the game, before you and I really started working heavily on the design and development process together, was taking the chance to do a Marvel Crisis Protocol miniature game and not necessarily make it a game of high-level strategic chess with miniatures on a cool battle top. The goal was to create an experience that two players would share. They would pit their tactics and their choices and things against each other, but the overall goal of the game was to create a sense of creating your own Marvel story on a tabletop, to see the narrative unfold, to feel the characters back and forth, and to create those cinematic moments. And that's really the goal, I think, for me, of everything we do in Crisis Protocol. And there are a lot of design choices and concepts that we injected into the initial designs in order to achieve that kind of like larger goal.
Yeah, why don't we talk about some of those concepts right now?
Yeah, so number one, the first decision that was made was that we were going to make a game that was character focused. We could have easily probably gone the route of something more mass action with a lot of troops or grunts, with being led by heroes or things like that. And to me, that's not the core of what Marvel comics are about, not what the stories are about. Those larger battles do occur from time to time, but the thing that really sells the Marvel comic experience, the Marvel experience in general, is focusing around these really awesome characters, their personal struggles, their personal growth, their awesome powers, and then these climactic battles that they have in trying to push forward their agendas. So very quickly on, it was like, okay, well, there's no question in my mind, this is going to be a skirmish level, small squad based game, so we can really dive into these characters and make them the expressions on the tabletop that we want to see from the comics.
Yeah, absolutely. How I kind of see it, right, is in a lot of the movies and a lot of the comics and stuff, like Captain America fights through all these little dudes, but then he gets to the guy at the end. Mm-hmm. And that guy at the end, that's the game of Crisis Protocol, right? And it was very important to us that we stayed small miniature count, essentially, on the table, because that does a few things for us, right? One, it lets us be a little more detailed with each miniature in terms of the rules, because we can have a little more complexity going on inside of each character if there's only 3 or 4 or 5 characters per side, right? Mm-hmm. It also gives us a much faster gameplay style, so we can do more games more quickly. I don't think that's how that works, but whatever. English, who cares? And then I think this also ties a little bit into the affiliation, right? Mm-hmm. And let's go with it.
Yeah, and so another part that was really core to this, once we had determined, like naturally right away, that it was going to be character focused, was how do you approach that list building? How do you approach the way in which players will engage with these characters on the tabletop? And to me, there was zero question, as someone who's read multiple different story arcs and has character favorites from all over the place, that I want my Spider-Man to be able to team up with my Taskmaster and have a splash of X-Men in it for flavor and fun. The idea of playing in the sandbox was really important, and so very quickly it was just like, we're not even going to worry about hard factions. There aren't good guys, there aren't bad guys. If you've read any number of comics, you realize that that is basically true in Marvel Universe. They lean one side or the other, but it's not extraordinary to suddenly see a villain teaming up with heroes against a common foe, or for villains to use some kind of nefarious mind tactics to bring people over to their side and fight with them in that way, or just Skrulls. It could just be Skrulls.
It could always just be Skrulls, right?
So
always.
So that definitely tied into it. And then I think another really big one was the interactive terrain. Like, I couldn't imagine a Marvel game experience that didn't involve the destruction, the throwing, the interaction of terrain. Having a gorgeous three-dimensional tabletop in a miniatures game is one of the key things to me, to what draws me to miniatures games, what drew me initially to miniatures games. But this game, I knew had to take it further. Like, we had to see that car be able to be thrown by the Hulk, or otherwise, what were we doing with our lives?
Yeah, I remember sort of the first meeting where I was super sleep deprived after having my child, and I came in, and you kind of gave me the pitch, and I was like, hold on, we can throw the terrain at each other? Like, this is awesome. So building a game around a system where terrain wasn't just something you played around, but you actually used it in the system, and you used it as part of your strategy, but more so than just like hiding behind it, I think is a great pillar of the game. And throws being like a incredible portion of it, right, is great. And then as we're developing more into the game and as we're seeing further stuff, we're starting to see more rules that interact with the terrain in different ways. Like, we've recently shown Green Goblin. I believe there was some Punisher spoilers going on yesterday.
We may have talked about Warzone, the one that gave you quite a bit of a headache.
Oh, yeah, I mean, and it's been really fun and interesting finding new different ways to interact with the terrain in the game and exploring that design space to really bring characters to life, where it becomes sort of more than just a battlefield that you're occupying, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So that was another huge part of the initial design of the game, and something that we are absolutely embracing as we go forward.
Yeah, the other one ties back into what you talked about in your design philosophies, which is the idea behind the power mechanic as a resource and what it means to the game. And to me, I kind of define the three pillars of the game as the power mechanic, the interactive terrain, and then the open dynamic squad and mission construction that we landed on. But the resource mechanic does a lot of things that I think are really important from my viewpoint on the game itself. It builds tension. It allows players to feel that ramp up of the climax of the story. So our characters start off and they're punching each other and they're taking damage, and then all of a sudden it's like round 2 or 3, and now they're starting to do a lot more cool stuff, and then a character gets completely like dazed in one hit. They stand up on the next round and they do everything, and it's super awesome to watch, and it's very thematic, and they get their moment. And so all of that ties back in to player choice, because how are you managing that power resource? How are you pulling those things together? And so for me, like, that's the gel that makes the whole game experience really work.
Absolutely. I think the power mechanic and then the daze mechanic, those two combined, are, to me, from like this is actually not a game, it's a spreadsheet, which it's obviously a game, but from like that, without those two functions in the game, I don't think the game would really work, if that makes sense. Like, could we do a different resource system? We certainly could have. Could we have not done the daze mechanic? I'm sure we could have figured out something, right? But I think the daze mechanic and how it interacts with power and how it lets you feel as a player, because remember, player choice is also tied to player feelings. And we want you to feel good when you're playing the game, right? And it never feels good if your favorite character runs up and then just gets punched to death, right? Like nobody wants that, right? So that daze mechanic is very important when combined with the power mechanic, because it always lets you feel like you're doing something awesome. And I mean, always, I'm sure somebody in chat will be like, well, somebody died, but that's fine. Most of the time, characters will get to do a powerful thing. And you get to choose what that thing is. And to, I guess, flash forward a little bit into our panel to play tomorrow, it is also very important with us that characters, generally speaking, can't do everything that they want to do every turn, right? We want you to have to make those choices. So,
yeah, I mean, I think
thing.
that dives into character design and in general, right? It's you have to pick things to focus. If a character can do a lot of things, they do a lot of things pretty well or okay, but they can't do things as good as somebody who's solely focused on that one thing. I think a great example is like Crossbones punches you really hard. You know, that's what he does. He hits above his weight class, and he's pretty survivable. He's just a melee bruiser. That's what he does. He doesn't really do anything else. And then you have characters who have a wider range of things that they can do, kind of like Red Skull, but he doesn't particularly excel at any one thing. You know, he has a couple of things that stand out, but he's more just averagely good at everything.
Yeah, I think, and we'll certainly talk about this more tomorrow when we talk specifically about character design, right? But what characters bring to the table is highly variable and is certainly dependent on their threat value and how much they bring to the table, right? So that kind of seems like enough on the initial concepts here.
Well, I want to touch on one more because
Okay.
I think it was your number one most important contribution in your sleep-deprived nature. Because we did the initial run through in the play, and you sat there with a grumpy look on your face because you hadn't slept in like a week. And I was like, well, it doesn't really seem like he likes it. And then you were like, this is great, needs more pushes and movement shenanigans.
Yep.
And I was like, okay. So
Yeah. I mean, in the action economy of the game, right? We didn't restrict players to say you can only attack once or you can only move once and that kind of thing. And what that does is it opens up player choice, right? And it can create very powerful strategies in the game where you can attack twice in one turn instead of only once in one turn, or you can move twice. And movement in our game, I think we can do an entire section, like an entire 1 hour speech class, I don't know, whatever this is called, on movement and how it affects the game and the game design behind it and that kind of stuff. So I won't go all into that right now. But because we didn't put those restrictions in the game, it's very important that it doesn't just turn into a pile up in the middle. And having throws and pushes and things like that that can move characters around lets players make those choices to move opposing characters, to move their own characters in ways that are just not the move action. So what that does is things like overpower from crossbones, since he's our chat favorite at the moment, lets him throw people and then he places to them. So if you have to get somebody off a point, you can do that, and then you can put crossbones in between them. And it stops them from contesting a point. So now they can't double attack. Now they have to move an attack if they want to get back to the point. So it creates these interesting choices for players to make as they move around the table and how they choose to position their characters, essentially.
yeah.
And
So
without it, it just kind of turns into a pile up and brawl.
right, which
Great.
kind of feeds into our next thing, which is the creating the feel of the game, the expression of the game that we wanted. And a big thing that started even at the front was that combat wasn't how you win the game. It was important to moving the action along and to scoring, but it was always going to be an objective, narrative, mission-based game. And in that first one, it was like, okay, everyone grab their stuff, and then it was just like pile up and beat on each other until you can get somebody dazed or KO'd off the point. By adding in that more dynamic movement, more pushes, more things that will affect opposing characters' game state, you know, it added more emphasis to, well, I could go punch Black Widow and probably daze her or KO her, but that's not going to advance the game for me. So maybe my better play is to go over and grab an objective, knowing that Black Widow might activate next and then come after me. So now you have this really interesting tactical and higher level strategic consideration that's going on in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, and you're watching that game clock go. And I'm really happy with the way that the 16-point win condition works, because it drives the action in a really meaningful way. You can't slow play necessarily if your opponent's really starting to rack up points. You have to engage right away, and at least keep those VPs in your mindset. And to me, that feels very Marvel story, right? Even when the big bad guys or the heroes well outpower their opposition, they're still always primarily focused on whatever the thing is in the story they need or the thing they have to do, right? They don't just go, well, we'll knock them all out and then we'll deal with it later. It's like, oh, no, this is the most important thing. And that's always the reason why those narratives work, because it gives the other side, the underdog side, that chance to be like, okay, well, we can still come back and steal this.
Yeah, and I think that that gives us another power level axis for characters that are not just how well does this character punch, right? So how well a character can play in a crisis or a specific crisis, even where, because there are a bunch of different types of crisis, right? And you need different characters with different strengths for each one. That pushing, throwing, stealing tokens, like all of this kind of stuff gave us options inside of characters to really not only progress the game in a design perspective. Once again, game as a spreadsheet, not as a spreadsheet. But it also let us add all this flavor to characters, right? Like it gives us so many things that we can do with characters to interact in unique and different and interesting ways.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things to note on the balance and the spreadsheet thing, and this was kind of a compromise in terms of what we wanted the game to represent, is that characters needed to feel right, but we didn't want minutia separating them, right? The goal was that we had a very small range band of things that we could balance within, and then because the game's scope was narrative and it was meant to empower players to be able to do the stories and the experiences they wanted, we were able to just like make sure characters felt right within that band, and we didn't have to worry about, is Black Widow 1, is she a 72, is she a 73, a 74, compared to Hawkeye's 70, 75, like whatever. And I think those things, like at some point you get so far down that those things become crippling, not just to good game design and good experiences, but also to the nature of Marvel and to these characters, which is that, you know, we want to be more concerned with taking the characters that are meaningful to the player, that are going to let them build the team they want, and then to go have fun and tell an interactive and engaging story. And so that was part of like the whole like making characters feel right. And then of course the flip side of that, and the most difficult side, is how do you take a character like the Hulk or an Iron Man or Red Skull who has been in comics for 50 plus years with radically varying power sets and storylines and what they've done, and then condense all that down into this character on the tabletop. And we'll talk a lot about that in panel and play, but at the end of the day, it became a question of a balance of balance, and then also making sure that that character represented kind of the overall zeitgeist of what that character is. And sometimes making compromises, knowing that we would be doing different time periods of these characters, so this represented a specific kind of like moment in that character's history.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important one to stress as well, that we'll certainly talk more about tomorrow. But each character at the moment is them in a specific storyline, right? It's not the character as a whole. Because I think some people get a little hung up, like, oh, well, why doesn't he have this kind of special role? Why don't they have this kind of thing? It's like, well, maybe another one in the future that does have that kind of thing. But this isn't that one, right? So.
Yeah, it's like on top of the incredible like selection of characters that Marvel has in it, that is, and every character is the favorite of someone, so you want to get to them all. You also have so many iterations of so many of these characters, and that's another like big responsibility as far as I'm concerned in terms of how we manage and how we move forward with development and how we design the game and what our overall goal for the game is. And at the end of the day, the most important thing I think we all agree on is that the player can choose the characters that mean the most to them, and they can play a game and feel like they had a good experience. It may not be the most powerful thing. It may not be the optimal play, but I think a lot of the steps that we've taken with our game design and mixing the randomness and mixing kind of all of these different elements is to make sure that the optimal play isn't really as optimal as it might be in other situations. And that allows players to tell the stories they want, to have the experiences they want, and not feel like they're already on a back foot. And I think one of my favorite moments when we were initially testing the first batch of like 50 plus characters was when we'd take your stack of playtest things and we just randomly shuffle out 10 characters and be like, okay, what do I do with this? And am I going to have fun with it?
Yep.
And that was really illustrative too, that we were on the right track, I felt, as we start to see success with that random nature. You know, sometimes you could play in affiliation, sometimes you couldn't. Sometimes you had characters that made a lot of sense together, and sometimes they were like the random four corners of somebody's crazed mind.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, it was like, it worked, it was fun, it was engaging, and the players were like, yeah, I might actually do this later, because it was enjoyable.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe we do an OP event with that or something. Shuffle your characters, put out, go. That's what you get. That could be interesting. Going back to our roots there. Yeah, so why don't we talk about specifically creating Crisis Protocol and what our goals were for that?
Dive in, my friend.
Well, actually, you have a wonderful monologue that you love to do about complexity and things like that, and I think now's a great time for that. And I'm
okay.
to help along with that. But
so the way that I view game design and development in general is that every game has a budget, and it's a complexity budget. So it can be as big or as small as you want, but you have to determine that going in, and the amount of budget that you have will dramatically affect what the game looks like, how accessible the game is, you know, how real the game feels. It is a simulation, it's abstract. So at the very start, we kind of set our complexity budget for Marvel Crisis Protocol to be what I would call moderate. And especially compared to a lot of the tabletop miniatures games out there, it's Marvel comics. Like, simulation is not important to telling the experience in the story. You're talking about people who roll around in radioactive waste and come out super strong with crazy spider powers or radar sense or all this other stuff. And there's aliens and a whole cosmic universe. And there are these altering gems that can affect the very fabric of reality. So can this person strike somebody who's standing on top of terrain? It was like, yeah, they could, because I've never read a Marvel comic, although this would be a great panel for humor, where like they're fighting and all of a sudden they find themselves, like one person's on street level, one person's on like the skyscraper. And so the next 3 pages are the dude like climbing up the stairs of the skyscraper. Well, his opponent just kind of waits and checks their phone, and then finally the guy shows up and he punches them, and they're like, okay, now we can do it again, right? Like, that's not the experience. That's not the story. So by choosing that, by knowing that that was a fact, then we knew we weren't going to spend complexity budget there. We were going to make the action the focal point. We were going to make sure these characters felt heroic and they were able to do things very quickly, and to be engaged. There wasn't a waiting point. There's not a lot of positioning. I think one of the great things that you did in terms of complexity budget and like the game experience was we initially had characters deploying further back, and you were like, well, this just means the first turn is like people moving, and that's not what we want. So we advanced that forward, and now all of a sudden we removed around where there's a lot more positioning and there's no action happening. So we got right to it right away. But the complexity budget is really important because where you spend that complexity matters. It will change things. So where we decided to spend complexity was on things like the throwing of terrain. A lot of complexity was like spent in the power system and the economy and how that worked. We simplified where we could, and we streamlined in a lot of areas that make the game less of a simulation, but I think feel much more like that comic panel or that movie that you love, where these characters are being these characters. And so it's one of those things that, as an overall philosophy of game design, I think can be a big trap, where somebody goes, well, I'm going to make a great game for teenagers, or like for families. I'm going to make a family game. And then all of a sudden they're like, okay, but my complexity, but I'm going to have like 100 points in complexity rather than the 20 that you probably should for that kind of group. And then not allowing yourself to take out complexity debt. So there are definitely times when we were working on Marvel Crisis Protocol, in fact, Elevation was one, that I had 2 different methods in the original design document. There was cover and then there was elevation, and they gave different benefits and you could get them both at once. And to your credit, Pagani, you were like, well, this is going over our complexity budget. If we just cut this out, we can put more complexity somewhere else where it really needs it and is meaningful. And that's really kind of, I hope, an easy kind of example of how that complexity budget needs to drive forward the choices that you make when you design a game.
Yeah, and if we want to get specific, I think we can talk about standardization of rules at the moment and that kind of thing, because that's a huge thing for me as well, is when we have two rules that are very similar, I will always fight with Shick for them to be the same. And I say fight because when you're developing with a designer, right, it's not like we're in the office yelling at each other, right? But it's like, hey, we should standardize these two things because then we can, one, it's easier for players to understand what's going on and that kind of stuff. And then two, maybe we can do some other cool stuff over here, right? To spend more of this complexity budget. And sometimes there's excuses to not standardize, right? Like with throws, for example. When you're throwing a character, you measure from the character that you're throwing. When you're throwing terrain, you measure from the character doing the throw. And I would have loved to have it standardized, right? So that you measure from the terrain or from the character doing the throw on both, right? But both presented their unique problems, so we just couldn't do that. Throwing from terrain, you end up with someone throwing a bus like, I don't know, inches, right? Like they're at one end of the bus, and then the bus is this long.
It depends on the size of the bus, which is the biggest problem, right? It's like, well, my bus is this big, and your bus is this big. They're both the same size.
Yeah, and then if you throw the character, the opposing character, from the character doing the throw, now you can throw the opposing character like, I don't know, I'm bad with cameras here. I don't know how much of this. You throw opposing characters behind you, basically, from where they are, and they move like astronomical distances. They move like a third of the board, right? So that didn't work out either. We tried all of these things. So we just kind of agreed that we were going to have non-standardized throw rules.
Another place where we actually spent complexity budget and then removed it to spend it in other places like on the throws, which ties right into it, is that originally in the game, a dodge roll was not done like a defense roll.
Yep.
You used to not get crits on the dodge roll.
Yep.
And that stuck for a long time, and then eventually you did convince me that it was better to just have the roll be the same. And I'm very glad that we went that way, because it did remove that budget where we could put it elsewhere. So yeah, it's a lot of those choices, right? Like you can stick with things and be like, but I really like this rule, and so we can just keep it, because you can write as many rules as you want, but every rule you have is part of that complexity budget spent. And I think the other thing that's really important from the design standpoint, as well as it goes into like the world, is, understanding and being okay with where you were, right? Not every game is for every person. Not even every rule in a game that people love is for every person. Like everyone's going to have their own flavor, their own taste. The best you can do is make sure that you've created something that you feel confident with, and that other people enjoy and are getting the experience you want out of it. And at that point, it's like, yeah, we're all going to like different things. It's just like the characters. We're all going to think about different things when it comes to a Spider-Man or a Hulk, because we all have our favorite storylines and our favorite moments. But if you can just encapsulate the best of it, then you're going to do very well. And you can't let yourself get scared by being like, well, I have to try to make everyone happy, because you'll just make everybody unhappy.
Yep. So picking where to spend your complexity budget, I think, is the most important part. And that segues wonderfully into the goals, the specific design goals of Crisis Protocol. Starting out, we knew we were looking for narrative style rules. So whenever we have a rule, we're going to name it something narrative, right? We're going to name it something that makes sense for the character. We're going to make sure that that specific rule makes sense and does something that character does, right? And that allows the players to use those rules to create a storyline for their character that is, at the very least, in the same vein of an actual Marvel storyline, right? You, of course, get to put what you choose to do on that storyline, but I mean, Spider-Man doesn't shoot energy beams, right? So he's not have an energy beam attack. No, it would be cool if he had an energy beam attack. So having those narrative rules, and this is going to kind of tie back into like the movement stuff, right? Allowing players to manipulate the battlefield, allowing players to manipulate other characters, allowing players to manipulate their own characters. When I say manipulate, I mean like move around the table or put effects on or attack or things like that, are all super important. And we wanted to make sure that every single thing that went into the game has a narrative reason to be there. If it doesn't make sense for the narrative of the character, the narrative of the crisis, the Marvel narrative in general, we're not going to put it in the game. And that was sort of one of the primary design goals, I guess, of the game, was making sure that all of these things are flavorful and exciting and not boring, I guess.
Yeah, and I think the way, the benefit of that is that we do approach the design of these characters from is this character a tank? Is this character a bruiser? Is this character a manipulator? Is this character a support? But what we don't have to do, because we have such a wide breadth of characters and we have a lot of timelines to play with those characters, is we don't have to say, well, we have to have, like in the core box, we have to have a bruiser. I guess we'll just make Loki a bruiser because that's what we have. And then we have to like shoehorn all these rules to make him work that way. Yeah. Instead, we can tie those things very early on to what the character is, and that helps define what they do. And sometimes we get to break rules and we get to bend things a little bit. But, and then those things transfer back to, does the character feel right? The classic example is Spider-Man, which we talked about when the game was coming out. The goal of Spider-Man is to be control. He's that squad in the core box's element of like, he can really disrupt. He plays the disruption game. And the impetus from the comics is that if you look at Spider-Man, he's really annoying. He never shuts up. He's always like making fun or quips, and he's pulling people around with web lines and webbing them up, and sometimes he punches you. But he's really disruptive, especially in certain lines like Ultimate Spider-Man, when he's still kind of like developing his powers. He's not quite there. He's on the rise, and that was kind of the influence. And so by putting a lot of rules in where he's throwing terrain at you, throwing characters around, pulling characters around, you made a character that's really obnoxious to play against. And to me, really evokes that idea of Peter Parker as this like sarcastic, quip-throwing, bouncing off the walls hero character.
Absolutely. 100% agreed. We do have a question in chat that I want to talk about, which is Dizard here asks, why have multiple abilities that do the same thing but have different names? And I think that ties exactly into what we're talking about right now. It ties into that narrative aspect, right? Because if everyone had invulnerability, and this is the example that Dizard used here, different characters achieve. So what invulnerability does is it reduces the damage you take by 1. Different characters achieve that invulnerability through different ways. And if we had just called it invulnerability, right? Like we couldn't get Tony Stark's awesome suit. We couldn't get Black Dwarf's impenetrable hide. We couldn't get Being of Immeasurable Power for Thanos, right? And what it does is, while we standardize the rule itself, that makes it easy for players to understand. But if it still has a different name, we can get that narrative in there, right? We can tell people why this character has this kind of stuff, because we don't have flavor text or anything on our cards. And if you may not necessarily be familiar with the character, it has it. So it sort of gives a little explanation as to why, and gives a little bit of feeling and a little bit of flavor inside of there, instead of just having invulnerability, right? Because, I mean, Corvus, his invulnerability is called like Glaive of Immortality, I think, right? And that shows that like Corvus himself isn't what's invulnerable. It's sort of this glaive that protects him and regenerates him and rejuvenates him. And you wouldn't get that flavor if you didn't have those differently named rules necessarily.
Yeah, so. and this was definitely one of those compromises. You talked about how like you're always pushing for rule standardization from a complexity standpoint. And largely I was on board with you. I'm like, I'm fine with standardization, but you're not going to get standardized names ever.
Yeah. And we talked about a couple different things here, right? Like we talked about, like, do we take invulnerability and make it a keyword, right? And then you can make Glaive of Immortality. This character has invulnerability. That ended up in a different direction for complexity, which is we don't want that many keywords, right? We want the cards to tell the player exactly what the character does. So the less keywords that we can have on a card, the better. That's why whenever we have like Wild Bleed, it will always have the rules text for what that means. Because we want you to sit down with your cards and be able to play your game and just, you're good. You don't have to go look up stuff in a book or anything like that. And there are some keywords, right? Like saying that there aren't is foolish, because there are. But the fewer that we have and the simpler, more simple that they are, the better. Because then, like flight, I can move over stuff. I'm good. I don't need to look that up, right? So if we can keep all of our keywords in that vein, that is our goal. For keywording and that kind of thing. Weird tangent.
And I think the card discussion ties back to complexity budget too, because by making the decision that we were going to make sure that the card told you everything you needed to know, we also achieved a really core design goal for the game, which was that players can just come to the game and they can strategize at the table. There's not a requirement to put in a lot of homework before you go play your game if you don't want to, right? Yeah. You can show up, choose your characters, read your characters, and you know what's going on. And you know largely what your opponent's going to do as well, because everything is there on the card. And I think this is really important because, especially for me, looking at games that I used to play in the past, when I had a lot more free time, when I didn't have two kids, and I didn't have necessarily the requirements and responsibilities that are laid on me now, like I had the time to just pore over, books and know all the rules and know where the reference was and all of this stuff. So when I came to the table, I could play the game, and I could play it very well and I could succeed. But as I got older and my time requirements, like my responsibilities grew, I still wanted to have those experiences, but I wasn't able to put in the time required to be able to experience it. And for me, that's a failure, because the table is what matters, that moment of playing and interacting with you. And if I spend my whole time flipping through a book or trying to reference stuff, and I'm not engaging with the person across the table because we're too busy like looking at stuff, or I'm too busy trying to figure out what the heck I'm trying to do, I've missed the whole point of why we should be at this table, which is, to me, the person across the table. Like, the game is important in that it is the vehicle that I get to experience and create with another person. I get to engage in a way that you can't engage in pretty much any other way like you can at a miniatures game or a tabletop game. And so this goes back to another thing that we talk about a lot, which is Marvel Crisis Protocol was never really intended to be a tournament competitive hardcore game where the winning was, the goal. Winning is important because, as all games, you're testing yourself against your opponent. But the important thing was the interaction and the engagement and the fun of the story. In order to achieve that, though, because I think a lot of people take that they call it a casual game, and then they say, well, a casual game just is an excuse to chintz out on rules. It's casual, we don't really care. The truth is that casual player, somebody like me who doesn't have time to do all that research and to learn everything before I come to the table, like, I need everything to be as clean, concise, and balanced as possible, because that's what's going to allow me to achieve that golden goal of being able to interact and have an amazing time with my opponent as we play out our story on the tabletop.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that all of that is absolutely our goal, and it also happens to align into a competitive possible game, right? Mm-hmm. So if you are a competitive player and you play Crisis Protocol, don't think that we are saying, like, you can't play our game because we want to be competitive, right? Like, you can play the game however you want. And if that's competitive, that's great. And we're going to talk about ways to play the game here in a little bit more. But yeah.
Yeah, again, the experience is all based on what you are bringing to that table, like what you're looking for. But I think whatever you're looking for, if you're excluding people based on trying to reach a goal, That's a choice, and it was a choice that we actively tried not to make.
Yes.
Because we wanted this Marvel experience to open up the hobby, to open up the tabletop game to as wide an audience as possible, so that the next generation can come in and learn the love and the passion and be part of the amazing community that you and I and everyone at AMG, for the most part, has been part of for 20 plus years. And I think that also drives back to the fact that a lot of us are parents, a lot of us have kids, and once you reach that point, you look at it as like, okay, what am I doing to prepare the next generation? What am I doing to grow what I love so that the next generation can have it and can have the same positive experiences that I had, the things that made, where I am in my life really impactful and important. And I think that's part of the responsibility too. And it's something that is always at our forefront in everything that we do when we design this game is, are we being exclusionary or are we being inclusive? And how do we reach inclusive as much as possible?
Yep. If you are interested in that specific topic of inclusivity in game rules, in terms of complexity and player availability, tomorrow panel to play is the thing for you.
Perfect teaser. Should we talk about game modes now?
Yeah, let's do it. Just to run through a list real quick of some ways to play Marvel Crisis Protocol. You have 1 versus 1. And there's kind of 2 different ways there, right? You have the to use our playtest example from before, you have the I'm going to pick random characters and see what happens kind of 1 versus 1, right? And then you have the I'm going to build a specific list with a specific narrative and you can play 1v1. And you have the I'm going to build the most powerful list rules-wise possible, and I'm going to play 1v1. So there's already 2 or 3 different ways to play the game right there, which is great, right? Because that lets everyone engage with it at the level that they're excited about. We've got story events. Well, we have, I guess, in the future story events. At some point, organized play will come back, and we will get to release things like Vibranium Heist and all sorts of other kits that we've had planned forever that we really, really, really want to get in your guys' hands because they're awesome. We have ultimate encounters. Ultimate encounters to me are phenomenal, and we'll talk more about it in a little bit. We also have cooperative ultimate encounters. We have that Ultron AI thing, and that's something that we want to explore more in the future. We have leagues. We have the Infinity Clash league going on right now. This is a short little 3-day league, but we have more plans for that kind of stuff in the future through organized play, through online resources, through things like that. And then I'll leave the kind of spoilery one after we're done talking about
Sure.
this kind of.
So from the very start, again, as a core part of the development and design concept that I initially worked on, I wanted to make sure that we were always looking and the game was built to support multiple game modes. Because, well, the standard experience is great and probably the primary way you're consistently going to engage with the game. The fact is that as a hobby miniatures game and as a Marvel Universe in general, the more opportunity and the more ways you can play with your characters, with the people that you have poured your heart and soul into, from paint jobs to kind of list construction to everything else, it just adds more to the experience. It makes everything complete. And I think it also makes the game more inclusionary rather than exclusionary because, Pagani talked about Ultimate Encounters. This was one of the first new game modes we knew we were always going to do. We were always going to do a multiplayer mode that featured teams going against a super boss. We called them raids originally. They're in the initial Gen Con keynote when we announced the studio and the game. These things were kind of our mile marker of the game's possibilities are pretty limitless if we allow ourselves to design around that concept and to build towards that. And I think the really cool thing about Ultimate Encounters is that they're a great way to introduce people who might be a little hesitant about tabletop miniatures games. And they're like, oh, I don't know about this, because it's much more board game feel. You can have 2 experienced players walking the novice through and kind of explaining things as they go along. They're very thematic. And you have that element of control where, the player who's playing the cosmic threat can go completely hardcore and try to win, and the players can face off against that. or they can take more of a game master role and tell a fun story and make an experience for those two other players. And I think like that flexibility, like you were talking about the 1v1, is so powerful because it allows so many more people to engage and realize the joy and the excitement that can be found in games like Crisis Protocol.
And that, I think, to me is the most exciting part of Ultimate Encounters. Is it's sort of like you choose your own level of play for it, right? And I love the idea of it being so accessible to new players if you're willing to make it that, right? Like, to me, it's almost like the perfect demo is to have somebody play Thanos and go against two new players and sort of walk them through it all and show them the narrative that is possible in the game and the idea and the excitement that can build from these Ultimate Encounters. So I love that aspect of those, and I think we've absolutely nailed it in the 3 Ultimate Encounters that are out so far. And I think we've absolutely nailed it in the ones coming as well. So
yeah, and I mean, the other really exciting thing about Ultimate Encounters and these different game modes, even diving in kind of the story mode, is we talk about all these different iterations of characters and how, you know, depending on the storyline and what you're looking at, these characters have different power sets. The Hulk is a great example. He was probably the most difficult of all of the initial characters to design and balance and make sure that he felt like the Hulk, but he wasn't horrible to play against, and that there were counterplays and things like that.
So we have two. Let me interrupt you for 1 second, and you can keep going on this. We have 2 questions from chat, which is Hindi Badger and Fallout Blood, both asked basically the same question, which is how do you create these superpowered characters while making them also balanced and interesting to play? And I think that's exactly what you're talking about right now. So kind of that question.
Yeah. So like the Hulk, right? We made what we believed hit the ideal of a Hulk that would fit within a team environment. You know, he has to be balanced against everyone else. He can't be the world breaker monstrosity that can take on anybody and walk out without a scratch, because that's not going to work within the game environment. But what Ultimate Encounters allow us to do is to break that mold. And so being able to create a Hulk and then know that we were going to do a Hulk Ultimate Encounter where the Hulk can be, you know, an army unto himself, that's another benefit of having these game modes and being able to balance around that. Thanos having all of the Infinity Gems and basically laughing as the Crisis teams desperately try to not really engage with him, but to depower him. It's another iconic Marvel moment, but it's a story that you can't tell within the standard game because things have to be balanced against each other. And that experience is different. So you open up so much more potential to re-explore these characters and to tell the stories that are iconic that don't fit within the narrative of the 1v1.
And I think to touch a little more directly, specifically on the 2 questions that were asked, right? When we make some superpowered level character, superpower not as in like has superpowers, but as in like would be threat 50 or something, that's what the Ultimate Encounters are for, right? We're going to make that version of that character in the Ultimate Encounter. And then we're also going to make a normal version of that character that uses the normal stats and the normal threat values and all that kind of stuff to play in your game. And where does that threat value end up for that character? Well, we've got Captain Marvel at a 4, which I think most people were shocked at the beginning, right? Because they're like, well, Captain Marvel can punch through a spaceship. And that's great, but remember that Captain Marvel has to be able to be played in the game. So making Captain Marvel in the core set of 4 let us create a Captain Marvel experience that players could enjoy while also not destroying everything around it in the game, right? Like ruining the game basically for their opponent. So I guess this can go into a different discussion on threat level and how characters are assessed for that level. But I think it's important to note that like comparing characters directly threat level to threat level in terms of comic power level is never really going to work out, because it's sort of this is what the character can do. This is how powerful they are. What threat level is that? Cool. 30 isn't going to work.
Well, I think like the other way in which I've always explained it, especially to Josh, because he's the one internally who's always like, but this person has this comic and they did this and they beat this person, so they should be better than this person. It's like, okay, the way that you have to approach Marvel Crisis Protocol from the 1v1 standpoint, from the standard game, is look at the team-up comics, right? Look at the Avengers run, look at the Defenders run, look at the ones where all of these characters come together and they have to work together. And in order to tell an amazing story, you can't just have Captain Marvel be the snap option that fixes everything, right?
Yeah.
So, well, she may be doing crazy stuff in her solo run when she's by herself and she's the focus. Once she's on the Avengers, her power level drops because Black Panther has to be just as important as her, and Hawkeye has to have his moments to shine. And that's the game environment of Marvel Crisis Protocol. So, well, I think the arguments of, well, this character can do all this stuff and should be this, like, Captain Marvel should just be outrageous. She's one of the most powerful characters in the Marvel Universe. Depending on story run and everything else that's going on, she's not necessarily that much far ahead of an Iron Man or a Captain America when you're reading the Avengers. Because if she was, there'd be no story. There'd be no excitement. There'd be nothing there. She would just go solve it. Mm-hmm. And so that's another mentality that we bring in, which is she's a 4 because the game is the Avengers comic run, not the Captain Marvel solo comic run.
And the Captain Marvel solo comic run would be an Ultimate Encounter or, perfect segue, a story event. Story events are currently things that are planned as organized play kits. We'll see how that progresses in the future with the pandemic and stuff. But story events, generally speaking, are asymmetric missions, essentially. And I know we haven't shown a ton about Vibranium Heist, but the idea behind them is that you get to recreate a specific point in a specific storyline, where you're not both fighting over cosmic cube fragments, right? So the Vibranium Heist is a heist story. You're getting in, you're trying to steal stuff, you're trying to get out, right? So that is another way that you're going to be able to play the game at some point in the future.
And I think the really cool thing about the story encounters, again, is the idea that these expand the options you have for the game, for gameplay experience, right? The Vibranium Heist one is, how do you make a heist game in Marvel Crisis Protocol? So you have Eric Killmonger, who's of course our focus for stealing Vibranium. We get to do a whole new version that's wholly dedicated and specialized for the mission because he's our focus character. And then, you get to build your perfect crack heist team if you're playing the Killmonger side, Ocean's 12 style, or you get to play the security forces. And I think the really cool thing in that one is that you get way more stuff on the security side, but you have to activate alarms to bring it in. And then the Killmonger team is running in and they're trying to crack codes on the computer to open the safes, and there's a bit of a random element there in terms of trying to crack the safe open and get the Vibranium and then escape. And, not to spoil too much, but one of the really things that's so much fun about that is Eric Killmonger is a beast in that scenario, but he's also typically the only one who escapes, which is perfect, right? Narratively, he's built to get in and just leave his team behind. He gets what he wants, and then he's just I'm out. And in every playtest, people would be like, well, he can escape with the Vibranium, and then everyone else will get knocked out. Or he can hang around and help them fight. Now he's getting out of here with the Vibranium. I'm gonna take the minor win. So yeah, but the story events are really designed to introduce fun expansion game content to the overall game itself. So everyone is kind of different. Sometimes they expand game experiences, we have one that's going to come out next year that's a 4-player free-for-all, which is pandemonium but super fun. The Vibranium Heist one is really great. Some of them will be new ultimate encounters for different characters, because one of the things that we talked about before but haven't really dove into directly is that we want to do ultimate encounters and expansion content that's free on the website. But we have to make sure that we're doing that within the realms of what players have available to them. So it's a different scope than something that comes in an ultimate encounter box. And now that people have Thanos, you can kind of see the separation and how much more stuff you can do in an ultimate encounter when it has components versus something that is kind of more light and introductory and just meant to expand the core game experience that players already have.
Yeah. And I think our current Infinity Clash kind of touches on the leagues, right? This is sort of what you can expect for leagues going forward as another way to play and another way to experience the game, which I think leagues and our last topic tie very well in together, Shick.
They do. So
Read this
obviously,
one, I'll get in trouble.
obviously, I mean, Josh is behind the glass, and he'd have to put on a mask to come in here, and I'm not going to put on my mask, so like he's technically he can't do anything. He can't do anything right now. He would just get in trouble. Like it's a perfect barrier.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the idea behind the leagues is that they're far-reaching scope. They're kind of like a story day on steroids, where you're going to be playing in a bunch of crazy missions. There's going to be stuff that builds on top of each other. So like the Infinity Gem effects that build each day in our Gen Con event right now. And we're going to break the rules even further than what we would do in a story day, or change the rules. Of course, I think the ultimate expression of hobby tabletop miniatures and the game experiences that they can tell, what makes them really unique is campaigns, right? The chance to grab your friends, get together, and tell a narrative over the course of several battles that are all built on what happens in each of your games, right? To tie that narrative together and to make this greater unity. And that has been on the list for us to do, and currently working on right now. So in the future, you're going to see these really expansive campaigns that are going to come out, and they're going to open up possibilities to really tell stories in a way that you've never seen before in Marvel Crisis Protocol. And Pagani is currently neck deep in a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, it's not small, I'll tell you that. This is the campaign stuff is going to be bigger and better than anything you've seen out of us so far, I think. So,
and again, the primary goal, as with everything, to kind of tie everything up with a nice little bow, is that that campaign that's coming out, and hopefully the campaign products that come out in the future, are all about helping the players tell their unique Marvel narrative that they get to keep with them, that they get to remember with their friends, that they get to have that shared experience of creative storytelling that lasts well beyond a single dice roll or a single game. And I think that's the magic of tabletop games, especially hobby miniatures game, and hopefully, if we've done everything that we wanted to do right, Marvel Crisis Protocol.
And I think the main difference, just to kind of touch on this one more time, it's the difference between leagues and the campaign is like leagues are you telling the story of the Avengers going through an event, whereas the campaign would be you making your own Avengers. Can I say that? I can't say that.
You just did, so it's too late now.
So you kind of get to make it more yours than specific.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to look at it. Like leagues are definitely, you're telling kind of a preset story. A campaign is
make the story.
You are creating the story wholesale with the materials that are provided in that campaign and the framework. But there's kind of a through line on a league, whereas a campaign is like, it can go in a lot of different ways depending on a lot of different variables, which makes them very exciting. And each campaign is going to be entirely unique between groups and sessions and everything else.
It's exciting stuff. Exciting stuff.
All right. So I think unless you have anything else you want to touch on, we're at time. So.
I want to rewind. I have one chat question here that I pulled out from RD Jones 78. When you were creating the throwing terrain rules, was there ever any talk of, if a character is similar to a building or whatever, place rubble created tokens and then you can do stuff with those, right? We talked a lot about the complexity of throws and about different options for things. And whereas I don't know if we ever specifically talked about that, throws were a massive part of the development of this game, like huge. And where we ended up is sort of the in my opinion, the perfect, some may or may not agree with that, balance between complexity, utility, and ease of use, right? Throws are pretty straightforward in the game, especially once you get them down, right? But they do have some complexity. How do you move along the movement tool, that kind of stuff? What happens when you throw characters into characters, blah, 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 blah. Like there's a lot of questions that come up about throws. So it isn't to say that they're like super easy to understand or anything, but like we added enough complexity to make them powerful, to make them interesting, to make them fun, without adding confusion or slowing down the gameplay of throws, right? And I don't think that is just a lesson for throws. I think that's a lesson for Crisis Protocol in general, right? It's how can we make things that function quickly, that keep players in the game, where they don't have to go look stuff up, or they don't have to place a million tokens or anything like that, so that you can keep playing, basically, right? Like we don't want you to have to stop and do something and try and get back into the narrative, get back into the game. So that's sort of I guess one of the big things when I'm working on the game, and what I look for is, does this slow down the game? And I would worry that something like placing rebel tokens or having structural integrity of buildings or things like that would slow down the game. Would it be cool? God, yeah, it would. That would be awesome. Like a bunch of bricks fall off, you can throw the bricks at people. I'm already excited about this. But I would worry that it would slow things down too much for something specific like that. So I don't think I have any other specific questions that I want to get to here, Shick. So
all right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, guys. Be sure to check the schedule for plenty more awesome streaming content. I know Dallas has a painting class coming up, and I believe the art class is today, but you can check out the full schedule at atomicmassgames.com/GenCon-online. So be sure to check that stuff out. And we will see you guys tomorrow for Panel to Play with Pagani and myself. We'll be talking more specifically about how we develop and design characters for the game. And it will kind of tail off a lot of the stuff we talked in here, but we'll also be talking about a lot more unique stuff. So be sure to check that out as well. Otherwise, have fun in the Infinity Clash event, and we will see you on the next one. Thank you very much, guys. Goodbye.
bye-bye.